There is a great deal of secrecy surrounding nuclear weapons, which is of course quite obvious when one considers that they are very powerful devices capable of destroying vast swathes of land and killing millions of people upon activation. The development of these devices was shrouded in great secrecy, and one may think of the Manhattan Project to begin with, but other nations too have developed them, and they closely guard the information regarding the component parts and of how precisely these devices work, such as the compressional properties and the physical chemical reactions that take place upon activation. All of these things are very closely held under wraps. But what is, if you may think of it, what is the greatest secret surrounding these devices? Is there in fact one? Well, it would appear that there is indeed. There is one secret that trumps all others when it comes to understanding the precise nature of how these devices operate. And this is an esoteric secret, you might say. And that is the fact that these devices, nuclear weapons, are actually allied to the field of astrology. That is to say, the influence of the celestial bodies in the heavens as affect events upon the earth. This science of astrology, most accurately described as the music of the spheres, is a science intimately concerned with the proper operational function of nuclear weapons. In effect, nuclear weapons can only be activated at certain points relative to the Earth when the Sun or the Moon or any other planets used are in a very precise celestial configuration. This is a real science, because the music of the spheres is concerned with resonance. Celestial resonance is operative within our solar system, and it is used to activate the devices upon the surface of the Earth, say. The musical frequencies, as are emitted by all planets and as rain down upon all planets, actually interact with the devices, and this is why they are space-time devices. They can only be activated at the right point in time and at the right point in space in order for the necessary effect of a massive explosion to be engineered. Now, I wanted to look at the work of a pioneer in this field, and I wanted to begin this presentation by looking at the work of Bruce Cathy. Now, he himself was the first outsider to crack this secret, if you will, of the bomb, and reveal that they are quite esoteric devices and based upon an ancient knowledge. Now, astrology is much derided in modern times as a kind of superfluous nonsense almost, but as a science it is very solid, provided one models things correctly. In this current presentation, I want to look into some of the deep secrets regarding nuclear weapons and try to reconstruct some of the classified data surrounding these devices and openly put it out so that you, the viewers, can look at this data and evaluate it for yourself. I will be presenting precise details in terms of how to correctly model the activation of nuclear weapons based upon the position of the Sun, and give several examples of this. So to begin then, I want to first consider the work of Bruce Cathy, who is the true pioneer in revealing how nuclear weapons work, who put out the secret that their activation is relative to the positions of the celestial bodies, and thus that astrology is not some abstract nonsense, but there is a true physical basis to it, and our physicists of the modern age appear to have uncovered this fact. Now, Bruce Cathy was born in 1930, and he was a commercial airline pilot in New Zealand for many years, and he became interested initially in the field of ufology, and this was in the 50s and 60s, and he decided to look at the flight patterns of UFOs and see if he could develop or see if there was a pattern to them, and this was in and around the New Zealand area. And what he found when he evaluated all the sightings that were coming in and being evaluated by many people, he found when he plotted them on maps around the New Zealand area that he could determine that they had distinct lines of flight, and that in many cases they travelled parallel to one another, and this was in a north, south, east, west grid-like matrix. And he found that the intervals of the matrix themselves conformed to the basic principles of angular measure as developed by the Sumerians and Babylonians, and that is specifically to a base 60 system. Our degrees, minutes and seconds of arc, these unit measures appear to be the very interval measures at certain harmonic splits which govern the intervals of the flight patterns or tracks of UFOs. So what Cathy was initially doing then, he was finding that what looked to be a real phenomena of interest, the UFO phenomena of a modern age, seemed to be tied into this ancient system of measure. And he was effectively trying to validate, if possible, the energetic significance, if you will, of these ancient systems. And so a subject like astrology or numerology or sacred geometry, if you will, he was trying to take these subjects out of the realm of abstraction and mysticism to see if there was a real physical basis to these particular systems. And this is what he appeared to find initially with his work upon UFOs. But his work went much further than this, and he looked more generally in the realm of physics. And one of the key discoveries that he made was that tied into what the ancients refer to as the music of the spheres. And again, this is tied in more generally to what people refer to as astrology, and that is that the positions of the celestial bodies can influence the Earth in some way. What he found was that nuclear weapons tests, as were quite well ongoing throughout the 50s and 60s, and many countries were developing weapons at that time, he found that he could tie in a nuclear event to the position of the sun itself in the sky relative to the ground zero position of the device itself. And again, the relations as modelled seem to be tied into these ancient systems of measure of the Sumerian and Babylonian civilizations, which basically go back 6,000 years. So essentially, Cathy was proving, if you will, that there was something energetically significant to these ancient systems of measure. And essentially nuclear weapons were like a proof of principle of this. But they also reveal essentially that our scientists are rediscovering occult knowledge that has been lost seemingly for a long time, and they are rediscovering this ancient science. It is a very esoteric science. And so this is then where Cathy's work developed into, looking more generally at things like nuclear weapons. And he also developed a theory regarding the basic Einstein equation of E=mc², and he developed a variation on this, which he tied into general concepts of harmonics. And this is explained in some of his books, such as The Bridge to Infinity and The Energy Grid. And one may also cite The Harmonic Conquest of Space as well, which he wrote later on. But getting back to the nuclear weapons then, when it came to nuclear weapons in the 1960s, especially the late 60s, he wrote up his theories in some of his initial books and some articles regarding the tie-in between the position of the sun and the activation of nuclear devices in various tests. And this appeared to have sparked a great deal of interest because he was approached by various intelligence agencies who seemed to be well aware of this secret, and they wanted to see what he knew about it, and even challenged him in a number of occasions. They actually said to him, well, if you think you know about this relationship, can you predict some future up-and-coming tests? And with respect to certain French tests that were being conducted in 1968, Cathy did go on record and date-stamped some predictions that he'd made about when the French would set off some of their devices, and he was found to be right. The margins of error were very low, essentially, and although the mathematics wasn't perfect, and this was pre-computer age, working pen and paper, if you will, the fact that he was so accurate as he was, to the extent that he was, and these predictions are, again, they're in his book, The Energy Grid, as the picture is shown on screen here. The fact that they were as accurate as they were proved that although he didn't nail the precise times as as precise as he would like, it proved essentially that he knew what patterns the scientists were working towards. He really had cracked this secret. And there were a few people tried to offer him a job, essentially. Basically, all the money he could dream of, his family, never wanting for anything material for the rest of their lives. But as a consequence, he would have to sign a secrecy oath. And they were really just wanting to shut him up, because he was revealing some important aspect of these devices which was tied into this ancient knowledge, if you will. And they were more concerned with the public knowing this than anything else. What they knew was well beyond what he was doing, and he knew this, and he did not take them up on the offer, and remained independent and continued to do his own research. Now, when we look at nuclear weapons then, and look at some of the things that Cathy actually found initially in the early stages, what he was essentially finding was that there are two aspects to a nuclear bomb. On the one hand, we've got the internal processes of the device, where we have the shaped charges surrounding, say, a plutonium core, and they are fired off to implode the device. Neutrons are fired to create a chain reaction effect, a supercritical state, and all of this occurs, within a millisecond. And so there's all of the compressional properties of the device, all of the aspects of the chemical and physical reactions, all ongoing, and these are all processes internal to the devices themselves. What Cathy was revealing, though, was an extra layer to this. He was essentially saying that there's a celestial angle to this, that these positions of the celestial bodies were also a part of engineering the nuclear event or explosion. And this then is what he found to relate to these ancient systems of measure of the Sumerians and Babylonians. And it was his evaluation and his modelling of nuclear weapons relative to the sun in particular, the position of the sun in the sky in particular, that led him to essentially physically validate and prove that there was something to these ancient systems of measure. One of the most important theorists that can help us to understand exactly how the celestial bodies could interact with a nuclear device to trigger a massive explosion is Walter Russell. Now, the character and the influence of the celestial bodies is musical in nature, and what Russell did was he did a massive evaluation of the periodic table of elements and built strongly upon the work of Mendeleev, and in many areas overturned certain key points about it. Instead of building up a periodic table composed primarily of protons and neutrons and electrons, built up as is conventionally accepted wisdom today, what Russell did was he actually drew out and gave structure to the elements, and did this by isolating their musical qualities. He developed his own periodic table of elements based upon a series of nested octaves, and looked at the wave-form nature of the elements themselves, and how they harmonically fitted together and were composed of different levels of pressure at different octaves. Now, what he was essentially doing then was demonstrating that there is a musical quality to the elements on the small scale, just as there is a musical quality to the larger celestial scale. The ancients themselves referred to the music of the spheres as being the science governing the celestial bodies and their motion. Russell here was showing that the same musical principles occurred at the smaller atomic level, and he spoke about the formation of matter, that is, form from formlessness. And he explained how matter is wound up and drawn off a universal vacuum of stillness, and it is formed into elements of different levels of pressure, and that these are composed in a very carefully organised structure that conforms to octaves. Now, a key concept in musical theory is resonance, and resonance itself is the principle by which one can cause a destructive effect to occur within an element or even a celestial body. Resonance works to disrupt systems and can even cause catastrophic failure, and occurs when one has a certain situation where a target object is impinged upon by waveforms whose wavelengths fit into the fundamental dimensions of the target object a whole number of times, so there is a harmonious fit. This establishes standing wave patterns within the target object, which then cause a massive destructive effect to that target object if the power is great enough. Now, when we consider then musical theory with respect to the elements, and also musical theory with respect to the celestial realm, we can see a linkage here. The harmonics and energetic waveforms that are assembled in the heavens due to the motions of the celestial spheres actively target and go right down to a target spot upon the earth where one has assembled a nuclear device, and there is a harmonic convergence of these celestial waveforms and their energetic frequencies upon the device itself. The components of the device, as are within the bomb, when the bomb is activated and one creates a certain energetic condition, that is, one creates a chain reaction which establishes a supercritical state for the nuclear weapon, this merely creates an energetic sound, if you will, at the elemental level. The waveforms associated with the elements are thus engaged in creating a certain musical signature, if you will. This makes the device vulnerable to the celestial waveforms operating within the bodies themselves within our solar system. The key configuration as assembled causes a harmonic convergence event targeted precisely at the location upon the earth where the device has just undergone a radical alteration to its makeup in terms of triggering the nuclear reaction. Upon my website ancientworldmysteries.com I present a great many web pages devoted to explaining the critical proofs that explain the validity of imperial measures as used primarily by the United Kingdom and the United States. And I demonstrate exactly how the measures of feet, fathoms, inches, ideal geographical miles, all of these measures as nested sets in terms of their harmonic fit, going from larger scale measures through to smaller scale intervals. I demonstrate how all of these measures fitting together are a part of a special nested set that are fundamentally tied into celestial frequencies, most notably the Earth's own number of days per year, which is the key frequency measure for our planet's orbit around the Sun. And this explains how there is a tie-in between the celestial musical frequencies at the large scale and also the wavelength measures, which when one scales down from large value measures such as ideal geographical miles, which are 6,000 feet, when one goes through stepping through the progressions, one gets to higher frequency measures which are tied into the atomic scale interactions. So here is the critical bridge between the celestial musical relations and their measures, and then we have the atomic level musical relations. The key measures of the imperial system are a nested set of special wavelength units, and these are the critical measures that are evident when one triggers a nuclear event. In my book, The Lost Age of High Knowledge, I give a comprehensive evaluation of many nuclear weapons tests, most notably those from the 1950s which were extremely high yield ones and have a prominent place in history. And I correctly explain how to model the interaction between celestial bodies within the heavens and the placement of the nuclear devices themselves upon the surface of the Earth or slightly above it. I explain in great detail, more specifically, how the Sun itself is more often than not the key celestial body used by military forces to initiate or engineer a nuclear explosion. There are key musical ratios evident with respect to the placement of the device relative to the Earth, and also the celestial position of a key body of interest within the heavens. Now, when I evaluate the nuclear weapons I look at in my book, I give precise details and specifications and state exactly how I am modelling them so that anyone can reconstruct the data, and I do an evaluation of a good 15 nuclear weapons, especially the most prominent. What I also look at though in great depth is not just the musical ratios associated with the arc length measures, but also I refine the arc length measures themselves in terms of imperial units. Now, in this current presentation I wish to give 5 nuclear weapons up for consideration. These are 5 weapons that I discuss in my book, but I want to just concentrate here upon the musical ratios associated with these devices upon activation and how specifically they relate to the Sun itself as a celestial body in the heavens. And I also wish to examine some of the potential errors that Bruce Cathy made, some of the assumptions he made in modelling which may account for why, although he appeared to get the patterns correct in terms of understanding what the scientists were looking at, why the accuracy was not quite as sharp as it could have been. My work on nuclear weapons demonstrates very clearly that these devices are triggered with literally split-second timing when there is an optimum configuration in the heavens. Usually it will involve the Sun as the primary body of interest. In the following presentation then, I am going to describe how precisely to evaluate and model a nuclear event with respect to the Sun specifically. One of the best sources of information for nuclear weapons tests, as conducted by the great power since 1945, is the Johnston Archives. The Johnston Archives present a very detailed description of each of the tests conducted by all of the major powers in terms of the precise location of the device, in terms of latitude and longitude, the precise time that the device was activated, and this down to the nearest second at least, in some cases less than that, and also detailed information about the yield values. In addition to having the information regarding the timing and location of a bomb upon activation, we also need the precise position of the celestial bodies in the heavens at the moment of activation, and this again to the nearest second. Now, one of the programs that was developed by the US Naval Observatory to give us this critical information is the ICE software, which stands for Interactive Computer Ephemeris. This particular software package can be used to give us the precise information we need as to the location of any given celestial body, the major bodies that is, within our solar system at the precise moment that a device was activated. Using this program, we input the universal time of the device itself when it was triggered. This gives us essentially a snapshot view of the major bodies within the heavens at that moment. Now, the Sun primarily is the body that is used mainly by the military forces as a means to trigger a nuclear reaction and a nuclear explosion. The two key things that we are looking for from this program are Greenwich hour angle and declination. Now, these are the equivalent of celestial longitude and latitude for a given body in the heavens. So Greenwich hour angle is basically a 0 to 360 degree sweep using the Greenwich meridian as the prime meridian, and this is 0 longitude. The latitude value is equivalent to declination, and this is using the Earth's equator extended into space. The equator of the Earth extended into space is known as the celestial equator. Values above or below that equator are declination values. As well as having a set of archive values for various nuclear tests and an astronomical package capable of determining the positions of the planets and the Sun and the Moon precisely at the times of those tests, one also needs an Earth ellipsoid model, and this is required for true precision. One cannot use a generalized spherical model, and this I believe is what Bruce Cathy did when I've studied some of his tests, most especially one in the Bridge to Infinity book that he wrote, which looked at a 1983 French test. He appears to be using a model which is based upon a assumed spherical Earth model and angular measures. The key thing though, in order to achieve exceptional accuracy and model correctly nuclear weapons and realize how they are based upon split-second timing, requires that one use a true Earth ellipsoid model. Now, we have at present, in 1984, there was developed the WGS-84 Earth ellipsoid model. WGS means World Geodetic System. Prior to that time though, we had a series of other models, and we have been constantly refining our models for some time now. The model that I use in many of my evaluations in my book is the International 1924 Hayford model. This is because many of the nuclear weapons tests that were carried out in the 40s and 50s that I do evaluate, at that time the Hayford model was a known model. The WGS 1984 model had not yet been created, and so thus the model that I use in my evaluations is the international model. Now, one important point to note regarding the tie-in between the astronomical package, which gives us Greenwich hour angle and declination values, which are celestial longitude and latitude, and the Earth ellipsoid model that we choose to use, one has to realize that the declination values as latitude angles for a celestial object are in fact geocentric angles. They assume sort of that the Earth is a perfect sphere, if you will, and thus one has to use a special equation to convert geocentric angles of declination into geodetic angles, which are then playing out over the surface of an ellipsoid Earth form. The calculation, or rather the equation form that you can see displayed, is the precise one that I use and is cited from my book, and this is the equation I use to transform the geocentric declination values from the ICE software developed by the US Naval Observatory into geodetic angles of latitude. And this is because the coordinates as given from the Johnston archives for the locations of the nuclear weapons are themselves latitude coordinates with a geodetic primacy to them. They are not geocentric latitude coordinates. So one needs to use values of the same type in order for the calculations to be correct. With all of the programs and the databases as specified then, all that we need now to do is to use a Great Circle Calculator program to calculate the values of interest with respect to a given nuclear weapon in terms of its position upon the Earth and the relative position of the celestial body of interest, which primarily is the Sun, and look at the arc lengths connecting up the bomb position to the Sun ground position, and also the ground zero position of the bomb to the equator of the Earth, which is another angle of interest. The program that I use primarily for this is perhaps the most simplest and best Great Circle calculator and most easily found on the internet. and this is by Ed Williams. The Great Circle Calculator allows you to determine an arc length measure connecting up any 2 points upon the form of the Earth using a variety of different models. It is set by default to the WGS 1984 model, but it also allows us to select the International 1924 Hayford model, which is the one I use for calculating the arc lengths associated with nuclear weapons tests prior to 1984. What we are looking at on screen right now is the key diagram that I use to explain the critical celestial relationships between the location of a given nuclear event and a given celestial body, whose energetic waveforms are employed to interact with the device to cause a massive nuclear explosion, and this through resonance. The line that one can see from the centre of the Earth radiating outwards is a line that goes to the centre of the Sun, and the Sun itself is usually the celestial body that most military organisations make use of to actually engineer a nuclear explosion. Now, there are 2 prime considerations at work with respect to this particular model, and they are highlighted by the 2 lines that one can see in red and in blue. The blue line represents a latitude displacement line, an arc length from the equator of the Earth. It can go either into the northern or southern hemisphere. In the diagram given, it goes into the northern hemisphere, and this is a description of a hypothetical nuclear device set just slightly north of the equator of the Earth. Now, the Earth model as used is an ellipsoid model as detailed previously, and thus the arc length is from the equator of the Earth either into the northern or southern hemisphere, and it is an elliptical arc. Now, the arc length itself as given is actually a displacement from what is maximum amplitude point. The equator of the Earth is the maximum amplitude of our planet. For if we consider the planet itself, it is in effect almost like a musical instrument. One can consider the axis of the Earth as being the still point of equilibrium. The polar regions, the north and south poles, are like nodal points, almost like fixed points on a string instrument, if you will. And the equator of the Earth is the maximum amplitude point, and thus one will find when one examines nuclear weapons that the displacement from the equator into the northern or southern hemisphere will invariably be of a progression of imperial units of measure in terms of feet or fathoms or ideal geographical miles, and the significance of the displacement will have a harmonic fit with respect to these units. Now, with respect to the other line, which is in red, this line links up the ground position of the nuclear device upon activation and the ground position, if you will, of a given celestial body. In the diagram itself, we are looking at the Sun itself as the celestial body in question, and the red line connects up both points, and this is an arc length over an ellipsoid Earth model. Now, what one will find when one examines nuclear weapons is that that arc length will also usually be of significance with respect to imperial measures, and it will be of a subtle progression upon a certain harmonic set. And one will find between either the same nuclear weapon or between different nuclear weapons upon activation, one will find that there will be musical ratios of significance which link up the arc length distances either from the equator to the ground position of the bomb, which is a pure latitude value, and also the arc lengths linking up the ground position of the bomb to the ground position of a celestial body. Now, the significance of the red arc length as given, one can consider that the Earth itself, rotating on its axis with respect to the Sun or any given celestial body, is tracing out a cycle, and thus we are again talking about a displacement. The ground position of the bomb can be considered a sort of 0 point, and the arc length linking up to the ground position of a celestial body is again a sort of displacement from that 0 point, and so there are harmonic linkages again of a musical energetic nature which are evident in terms of the latitude displacement and also the arc length separating the bomb to the ground position of a celestial body. Both arc lengths can be viewed as interchangeable musically, and both arc lengths are of great significance when it comes to engineering a massive nuclear explosion. This will become clear when one examines 5 of the most prominent nuclear weapons events in history. Of the 5 nuclear weapons that I wish to evaluate in this current presentation, 2 of them are classed as atomic devices and the other 3 are classed as thermonuclear. The key difference between the 2 types is that atomic devices make use of a principle of fission, which involves splitting up the atoms of large elements such as uranium and plutonium in order to generate a massive explosion, and this produces yields within the kiloton range, a kiloton being 1,000 tons of TNT, TNT being the explosive compound used as a standard for gauging the power of a nuclear weapon. Now, differing from the pure fission devices, which is what the early atomic devices were, as were first created in 1945, are the thermonuclear devices. Now, thermonuclear devices combine both fission and fusion as a process, and this produces vastly greater, more powerful weapons, and the yield values in TNT for thermonuclear devices are well within the megaton range, a megaton being 1,000,000 tons of TNT. The first device as listed is the device that was dropped upon Hiroshima, and this was in Japan, 1945 on August the 5th, and it was a free-fall bomb dropped from a B-29 bomber. The yield of the device was 15 kilotons, which was slightly less than the first device tested by the United States, which was in July on the 16th, just a few weeks previous, and that was the Trinity device, which had an estimated yield of between 20 and 22 kilotons of TNT. The Hiroshima device, though, was the first wartime usage of a nuclear weapon in the modern age. Now, with respect to the second listed atomic device, which is King, King itself as a device has its placing in history as being the largest ever pure fission bomb ever detonated by the United States, and King was also a free-fall bomb drop. In this case it was a B-36 bomber that delivered the bomb itself, and it was exploded over the test site of Eniwetok in the Pacific. Now, King had a yield of 500 kilotons, which was vastly more powerful than the Hiroshima device, but still it was not as more powerful as the later thermonuclear devices. Now, with respect to the development of thermonuclear devices, King itself was the second device of a 2-part series codenamed Ivy, and King was detonated some 15 days after Mike, and Mike itself was the first successful test of a thermonuclear reaction employing the principle of both fission and fusion to generate an explosion well within the megaton range. Now, Mike itself was not actually a deliverable nuclear weapon at that point. It was not an enclosed and encased bomb that was being tested. It was in fact an experiment, a 62-ton device essentially, which was created on Eniwetok Island in the Pacific, and it was used to test the principle of a fission-fusion reaction. The yield itself as produced was a massive explosion of some 10.4 megatons, that is 10.4 million tons of TNT, and was vastly more powerful than the later King device, which was the second device of the Ivy series. Now, moving on, one can see next the listing of Bravo. Now Bravo was 2 years after both King and Mike, and this was in 1954 and stands on record in its place in history as being the highest yield device ever tested by the United States, period. And this produced a yield of some 15 megatons. But it was also an extremely dirty bomb in terms of its radioactive contamination, which spread even 1,000 miles away from ground zero. The Bravo device was in fact approximately 2.5 times greater than the estimates produced by the scientists prior to its detonation, so it well exceeded expectations. But it was also a massively dirty device in terms of its contamination. Its yield value though was quite exceptional, and its placing in history is assured. Now the final listing that one can see is for a device codenamed Grapple Y. Now with respect to the other devices listed, all of those devices were US devices. The Grapple Y device was a device built by the United Kingdom, and this device was detonated on Christmas Island, which is approximately 1.67 degrees north of the equator in the Pacific. Now its yield is given as 3 megatons, which is slightly less when one considers the yield values of the other devices of, say, the US, which conducted a series of high yield megaton ranges throughout the Castle series, of which Bravo was a part. But the 3 megaton device of Grapple Y conducted by the United Kingdom is again a very prominent place device in history, because it stands on record as being the highest yield device ever detonated by the United Kingdom. In selecting the 5 nuclear events that I have, it was my endeavour to attempt to avoid being criticised for picking and choosing just any tests as would yield a significant relationship in terms of a musical character, as I will shortly demonstrate. One from 1945 up until the present time is quite well aware that there have been several thousand tests that have been conducted of nuclear weapons, most notably at the Nevada test site in the United States. Now, rather than be criticised for selecting any variety of those tests, I have chosen tests and also a wartime bomb that are very prominent in their placing in history, and this is to avoid such a criticism of me picking and choosing. Now, if one examines the methodology also that I have detailed, what you will be able to get from this is that if you use the same programs that I specify and the same archives, you will be able to replicate the exact same values as I will now present in the analysis. I intend to present a detailed evaluation of all 5 devices and demonstrate how the arc length measures connecting up the position of the bomb upon activation to the equator of the Earth, and also the arc length connecting up the position of the bomb to the Sun ground position, how those arc length measures define a precise celestial musical signature unique to each device, but also how the devices are interchangeable and linked via musical ratios in terms of a cross comparison of these significant arc length measures. And this reveals that the activation of a bomb is indeed determined by the critical position of the Sun at the moment that the device is triggered, in conjunction with the ground location of the device. The analysis as follows begins with a consideration of Hiroshima and Grapple Y. From the data as presented, then one can see that the target of Hiroshima and the shot Grapple Y, the primary details for both devices in terms of the time and the location of the devices and also the yield, they are taken directly from the Johnston archives as specified previously. Now the Sun ground position coordinates, these are very carefully worked out using the US Naval Observatory's ICE software, the Interactive Computer Ephemeris package 0.51 version. And in conjunction, one can derive then two types of arc lengths associated with each device, and these arc lengths are the pure latitude value of the device, north or south of the equator, which is an elliptical arc, and also the arc length which connects up the bomb position to the sun ground position. And one can see in the top corner to the right the basic template diagram, which again allows us to understand the relations in question. Now, with respect to the twin pairs of values for each of the devices as highlighted in bold, which are the arc lengths of interest, one can see that a very special relationship is existent between an arc length for each of the two devices. The latitude arc of the Hiroshima device and the sun ground position to the bomb position arc of grapple Y over the surface of the Earth at the precise moment that it was activated. Those two arc lengths, as can be seen, have a very precise ratio, which is almost dead on 3/2, which is a very basic, well-known musical ratio. And this again is a very exacting level in terms of the accuracy of achieving this ratio. I will go on to the consideration of the rates of error shortly after I've dealt with all 5 bombs, but you can see at present all of the values as given. The ratio of this musical type is very clearly evident between these two arc lengths, and there is a clear indication here of an intention at work. And this means that the grapple Y device was actually based upon a close variation upon the arc length latitude value of the Hiroshima device. The arc length separating the sun ground position to the bomb position of grapple Y being very carefully determined by the careful activation of the device at the precise moment when the sun ground position moving over the surface of the Earth, due essentially to the rotation of the Earth, achieved an arc length separation which gave us this musical relationship of 3/2. And this implies again a great deal of precision went into the activation of the device as well as the positioning of it. A clear relationship is evident therefore of a musical character linking up these two types of arc length. In the next comparison we have Hiroshima still, and this time Mike. And the Hiroshima device, the evaluation here makes use of the arc length measure which was ignored in the previous evaluation, and that is the arc length separating the ground position of the device upon activation, which from this freefall bomb drop was just slightly above ground, and the position of the sun on the ground. Again, one can use the reference diagram in the top corner to understand the relations. Now here the same type of arc for Mike is compared to the Hiroshima arc, and one can see here a progression which seems to be very close to bang on 6363, following on from the decimal point. And this, if it were to be an accurate and precise relationship in terms of the recurring number sequence, will give us the fraction of 7/11. So we can see that the Mike test, which is the first thermonuclear device, was itself based upon a close variation of the Hiroshima device, but in this instance not using the pure latitude arc, but using the arc length separating the bomb position to the sun ground position. Another basic musical ratio is thus evident via the celestial body that is the sun. Considering the remaining two devices then of King and Bravo, King being the highest pure fission device ever detonated by the US, and Bravo being the highest yield device ever detonated period, one can see that if we compare the two arc lengths of the bomb position to sun ground position, we get an exceptionally accurate relationship
which is the basic fraction of 8 divided by 3. And again, like with the other tests, the values, although all given in feet, tend to be approximately several thousand miles in length, and these values are dynamically determined moment to moment due to the rotation of the Earth. King and Bravo were detonated approximately 2 years apart or so, and one can see then the careful long-range planning in how one conducts tests with respect to each other, and how one is basing the arc length measures for one test upon a harmonic variation or basic musical fraction as those employed in previous tests. In the harmonic world of music, the relations which are of a similar nature and are fitting into one another, and they are of a similar progression, they are musically and energetically significant, and you can trigger an entire energetic series of harmonics, and this reveals why, when we examine these tests, there is a close musical relationship between the component arc lengths, and they are quite interchangeable as they play out over the surface of the Earth. The value here of 2.6666256.195 is an exceptionally accurate value towards the ideal of 2.6 recurring precisely, and this again strengthens the case for the fact that these devices are triggered with split-second timing when certain special configurations are achieved in the heavens relative to the placement of the device upon the ground. From a study of the various arc lengths associated then with the nuclear bombs under consideration, it can be seen then that they conform to certain precise fractional values that are encoded in many musical compositions, and the relationships themselves are very exacting, only differing slightly from perfection. One can see the summary of the ratios themselves, with the arc lengths for Mike and Hiroshima giving us a 11/7 fraction, Grapple Y and Hiroshima 3/2, and Bravo over King is 8/3. The various arc lengths then, a combination of looking at the latitude arcs, the pure latitude arcs north of the equator, and also the arc lengths from the ground position of the device to the sun ground position. The various combinations as detailed give us these precise fractions, or very close to. So what exactly are the error rates then, in terms of the values as modelled compared to the high precision of these fractions? Well, in order to understand this and quantify it, one has to understand exactly how the sun itself dynamically moves over the surface of the Earth due to the rotation of the Earth, essentially. We are familiar with the fact that there are 24 hours in one day. If we multiply that by 60, we have 1440 minutes, and multiply that by 60, 86,400 seconds. Now that then would be the total number of seconds that it would take for the Earth to rotate once, and for the sun to sweep out a complete circle over the surface of the Earth. In doing so, the sun itself will, for every second, approximately sweep out some 1,500 feet over the surface of the Earth. 1,500 feet. Now that is approximately a quarter of a mile or so, and we can see that this has definite implications when we attempt to quantify just how precise the values are in terms of matching up to the fractions in a perfect way. A very careful evaluation of the arc lengths and looking at how we might modify one of each pairing in order to give us the precise fractions allows us to determine that the error rates associated with the Mike and Hiroshima values for the 11/7 fraction, and also the grapple y over Hiroshima, giving us the 3/2 fraction, the error rates associated from the perfect fractions to those modelled are approximately 700 feet for each of these particular pairings. And when we consider Bravo and King, the fractional value of 8/3, the accuracy here in terms of manipulating just one of the arc lengths to give us this perfect fraction is the modification of one of those arc lengths for approximately 200 feet. Now 1500 feet is the arc length that the Sun sweeps out every second for the Earth rotating on its axis. So the very fact that we have these error rates of approximately 700 feet and also one of 200 feet is indicative of the fact that these devices were literally triggered with split-second timing. In order to achieve the nuclear explosion, the Sun had to be in a position which was harmonically significant, and this has definite strategic implications when one considers the viability of fighting a nuclear war. Perhaps the most well-recognized delivery platforms for nuclear weapons are submarines and also fixed silos, but one may also consider bombers, although they themselves have largely been replaced since the 1950s and 60s as the main delivery platform. Free-fall bombs can be delivered from bombers, or indeed the bombers can possess what are in effect missiles which can be fired at a target from some distance away, the bomber only getting into the general vicinity of the enemy territory, if you will. But in addition to this even, we can also consider the smuggling of nuclear weapons into a target country, and this with specialist teams who can be on standby to activate them at the right time in order to surprise attack an enemy, if you will. However, all of these ways in which one might deliver a nuclear weapon to a particular target site are bound by the celestial spheres. The precise position chosen and the activation of the device, no matter what the delivery platform, is governed by a key celestial body that is made use of to actually engineer the nuclear explosion. Usually this is the Sun, and also one may consider the Moon. These are the two primary bodies that one can make use of for this particular purpose. But what might this actually say about how a nuclear war itself might actually play out, as it were? Well, if one considers two countries which possess quite a substantial arsenal of weapons, and they were to engage in a strike-counter-strike scenario, then let's consider what would happen if one country were to launch a volley of several hundred weapons from a given delivery platform. In this instance, let us consider fixed silos in the ground. Being as each missile is bound by the music of the spheres, and each missile can only be activated in the enemy territory at a certain point when the Sun is in the correct position, if indeed one makes use of the Sun for this purpose, then one would have to either stagger the entire launch of the missiles in the volley, letting each of them travel at their best possible speed, or if all of the missiles themselves were fired simultaneously, one would have to engage in careful programming to alter the trajectories of the missiles so that they did not arrive at the target at the best possible speed, but took a sort of circuitous route, in a way delaying their arrival time so that the rotation of the Earth was such that by the time the missile synchronized with a certain key point upon the enemy's territory, there would be a special arc-length measure of energetic significance connecting up that point to a celestial body that is made use of. So one has to consider a sort of playoff between these two particular types of attack. Either one fires all of the missiles simultaneously and staggers their flight times, or one staggers the actual launch of all of the missiles and lets each travel at a best or optimum speed. Now, of these two particular options, by far the best would seem to be that which at least gets one's missiles off of the ground in as many numbers as possible and in as short a time as possible, and thus firing a grouping simultaneously and staggering the flight time would be the best bet, because at least one's missiles are not going to be taken out by conventional forces in the meantime. Now, when all is said and done regarding this point, it would seem that a nuclear war of a basic strike-counter-strike scenario would be a rather haphazard affair almost. It would not be an all-out event where one side would fire everything they've got and the other side would fire everything in turn that they have got as well. It would probably be an event which would play out over one rotation of the Earth in terms of the major events of a given day once the conflict began. There may well be a combination of targets and a combination of platforms used, but a decisive and absolutely overwhelming strike in terms of physical missiles would probably not occur. That said, even from a small number of high-yield weapons, massive radioactive contamination and death as a result of that would still be a major factor. In fact, that may well be even greater in its devastation than the initial missiles as fired. For those interested in a still deeper study of nuclear weapons and their celestial relations, in particular those that relate to the Sun and the Sun-ground position, one may consult my book, The Lost Stage of High Knowledge, where I evaluate many more nuclear weapons events, very prominent in history. Most notably, I begin with Trinity, which is indeed the first atomic weapon of the modern age as developed, but I also look at Hurricane, which is the first UK test, and also some of the larger devices detonated by Russia and France, and also the US. The Tsar bomber device by the Soviet Union in 1961 is a very prominent event of 58 megatons, and we also have the French test Canopus at 2.3 megatons, and Canakin being the highest yield underground test ever conducted by the United States at 5 megatons in the Aleutian Islands. These are all very prominent devices, and they also have very interesting celestial relations, and the evaluation of them can also be tied into earthquakes, which is again another very deeply connected area of this science. So for those familiar with these particular relations who wish to explore them even further, connecting up nuclear weapons even to earthquake science, my book is a very good source of information. But if you wish, you can also visit my website, and this gives you the proofs regarding the validity of imperial measures, and one can click upon the link in the description box just beneath this video in order to access my site, ancientworldmysteries.com.